Rosa arrived at the construction site early, before the sun even hit the scaffolding. She wore simple overalls, boots a size too big, and her hair tied back in a tight bun. It wasn't the first time she'd started from the bottom, but here, everything was new. Every step felt like a test, every glance a silent judgment. The workers whispered softly, as if she were a flaw in the project. "One more to make coffee," one of them muttered, not bothering to be discreet. But Rosa didn't look away. She'd been through much worse. This was just another obstacle among many she'd overcome in her life. In her firm stance, there was more than resistance. There was dignity. She knew that prejudice on the construction site was structural, and that women's work in construction was still seen as an exception. But she also knew what she carried in her mind and heart, and it was no small thing. While the others tried to silence her, Rosa took a deep breath and did what she did best: observe. She hadn't come in there to prove anything to anyone, but she wouldn't go in mute, nor would she leave silent. She was there because she dreamed and because she had courage, and that there was no quota that could be given. On the second day, the reception was worse. Now they knew she wasn't a guest, and that bothered her even more. The atmosphere carried that kind of silent machismo that hides in jokes and innocent banter. Rosa pretended not to hear, but every word carried weight. "The woman lifting bags of cement must be trying to get attention," one of them said, laughing out loud. This wasn't just ignorance, it was resistance. After all, women's work in construction was still seen as a threat to the ego of many there. And prejudice, as always, was disguised as a joke. Rosa knew the game, and that's why she never responded with anger. She responded with hard work, effort, and dignity. Each beam organized, each task completed with excellence, was her way of saying, "I belong here, yes." And little by little, even without admitting it, some colleagues began to notice. But it was still not enough. Most people insisted on treating her as an extra. It was as if she had no right to express an opinion, much less to teach. Little did they know that, even in silence, she was accumulating knowledge that would soon change not only that work, but also the mindset of those around her. The early afternoon silence was broken by a sharp shout. "This is no job for women!" The voice came from Fabio, the chief engineer, known for his arrogant and intolerant manner. He pointed directly at Rosa, in front of all the workers. The embarrassment was instantaneous. Rosa froze for a second. She felt her face heat up and her heart race. She could have reacted right then and there, but she chose to lower her head, not out of cowardice, but out of strategy. She knew that sometimes silence was also a form of resistance, and she would choose the right moment. Fabio continued to speak loudly, showing off as if he needed to prove a point. He said that construction work required strength, not finesse, and that no woman could handle the rigors of construction. It was the kind of workplace machismo that masquerades as tradition, and that still finds an audience. But Rosa wasn't shaken. Inside, she was already responding, "Concrete may be heavy, but the character of those who show disrespect is light." She knew that this episode wasn't the end, but the beginning. The clever response he so deserved was yet to come. What no one imagined was that behind the quiet assistant was a former civil engineering student. Rosa passionately studied nights, facing crowded buses, difficult exams, and double shifts. She was fascinated by structures, calculations, and everything involved in building, on paper and in real life. But life sometimes knocks down even those who are building bridges. A family tragedy forced her to drop out of college. She had to care for her sick mother, support her siblings, and put her dreams on hold. But knowledge, she never let go of that. She continued studying alone in the dim light of the kitchen. Scratched books, borrowed handouts, technical videos on her cell phone with an old headset. That's how Rosa kept her brain active. She knew her diploma was important, but she also knew that knowledge doesn't depend solely on a badge. Her silent intelligence grew in the silence of the early morning. While Fabio and the others boasted about their resumes, Rosa accumulated something that isn't taught in classrooms: resilience. Her hidden past wasn't shame, it was strength. And that solid foundation, built with sacrifice and perseverance, would soon become the foundation of her turnaround. The days passed and the building structure took shape. But it was one muggy morning that Rosa noticed something unusual. One of the newly concreted pillars had thin cracks, like tiny veins emerging from the surface. She approached silently and observed carefully. With a trained eye, the result of nights of study and practice, Rosa noticed that the spacing of the fittings was incorrect. It was a technical detail, invisible to many, but extremely dangerous for those who understand the subject. She knew it could compromise the safety of the entire structure. She tried to alert one of the engineers, but received an impatient look in return. "That's normal," they said. A construction foreman shrugged. She politely insisted, but was ignored. Prejudice in the workplace still treated her as an extra, even when faced with a real risk. But Rosa wasn't the type to remain silent in the face of danger. He sensed that if he didn't do something, an accident might happen. And worse, it would be yet another tragedy chalked up to fatality, when in fact it was carelessness. She knew what she had to do, and this time she wouldn't ask permission to speak. It was lunchtime, but Rosa didn't go down with the others. She stayed there, next to the pillar, notebook in hand. She took a deep breath, as if counting to 10 before a leap. When she saw Fabio approaching, she gathered her courage and got straight to the point. "Engineer, we need to talk." Fabio looked disdainful, as if he'd heard some nonsense, but Rosa maintained her firm tone. She clearly explained the flaw in the frame, cited technical standards, presented simple calculations that demonstrated the flaw, and finally suggested a viable solution based on her experience and research. The silence around them was audible. Some workers approached, curious. Rosa didn't speak loudly, but every word seemed to echo. Fabio tried to interrupt her, saying it wasn't her job. But here, more than just a job, was responsibility, and Rosa didn't back down. With calm and poise, she concluded, "I'm not here to replace anyone, just to keep the building from collapsing." Literally. That wasn't just an answer. It was a call to conscience. And what seemed like yet another attempt to silence became a platform for feminine courage. Fabio tried to counter. Ironically, he said that this wasn't a prep course class, and that it wasn't the assistant's job to meddle in structural calculations. But before he could continue, the construction foreman, a respected veteran on the site, stepped forward. "She's right, boss." The sentence came dry, firm, with no room for doubt. The silence that followed was louder than any jackhammer. Everyone stopped for a moment. The construction site, so full of voices, became a sea of exchanged glances and closed mouths. The engineer cleared his throat, disconcerted. For once, he had no argument. The foreman explained better. If the pillar were concreted that way, it could crack quickly. Rosa had saved the project from a serious error, and without shouting, without cursing, simply with knowledge. Gradually, the eyes returned to her, but this time, without sarcasm. There was respect, surprise, even admiration. The woman who had been seen as just another one was now the one who silenced prejudice with a practical engineering lesson. And that, no one could ignore anymore. With all eyes on her, Rosa took a deep breath. She knew this moment could pass by unnoticed or turn into something bigger. And then, with the same calmness with which someone who has been discredited 1,000 times communicates, she said the sentence that would change everything. "Concrete has no gender, but it does have character." It was as if someone had pulled the emergency brake at the construction site. Workers looked at each other. Fabio was speechless. The calmly spoken sentence rang in his ears and echoed. There was no arrogance there, only truth, the kind that's undisputed because it touches directly on the important point. No one applauded immediately, but the silence said it all. Those words cut through the work's machismo, prejudice, and hierarchy, and they didn't come from a memorized speech. They came from a real-life story, from a woman who faced prejudice every day with dignity. Rosa didn't say anything else. She didn't need to. She returned to her post as if she knew she no longer needed to prove anything to anyone. But the work was no longer the same. Respect, that was the truth, began to be built, brick by brick, and by a woman who took on the system with intelligence. The following week, activity at the construction site was different. A management car parked near the entrance, a rare occurrence. The employees looked at each other, trying to guess the reason for the visit. No one expected the topic to be Rosa, but it was. The construction company director, accompanied by senior engineers, asked to meet the employee who had prevented a serious structural problem. Fabio tried to lead the conversation, but the director insisted on listening to Rosa, and she, as always, said little, but spoke with authority. Impressed by her demeanor, technical knowledge, and above all, her courage, the principal didn't hesitate. He offered her support so she could return to school. He offered a full scholarship, plus reduced work hours so she could attend night classes. It was more than recognition. It was reparation. Rosa was speechless, not because she doubted herself, but because she never expected justice to come from above. And there she was, being valued not by the strength of her arm, but by the strength of her knowledge. The silent justice she had planted was finally beginning to blossom. The impact of Rosa's actions was beyond her wildest imagination. Little by little, the construction site, once hostile and full of jokes, began to change. Some workers who had laughed behind their backs now asked for advice, and respectful silence became more frequent than mockery. The board recognized the potential of this new environment and made an unprecedented decision. It launched a program of inclusion and respect in the workplace. This included lectures, discussion groups, and most importantly, new female hires. The presence of women in the construction industry began to grow. Fabio, once arrogant, now walked more quietly, still proud, but visibly transformed. Not because he was forced, but because he was disarmed. Rosa's words and her courageous attitude left a deep mark on him and on everyone else. A woman had changed the emotional foundation of that place. Rosa continued working with the same humility as before, but now she wasn't invisible. She was an inspiration. And more than building walls, she helped tear them down. Her moving story as a woman became an example of overcoming adversity, and the construction site finally began to reflect the world we want to build. Returning to college was a dream Rosa had buried, but that night, as she walked through the university gates with her backpack on her back, something inside her was rekindled. Now she no longer arrived embarrassed. She arrived recognized. She was more than a student. She was a symbol of resistance. Her classmates greeted her with curiosity. Some had heard of the auxiliary who corrected an engineer. Others approached her to ask for study tips or simply to hear her story. Rosa, with her calm speech and focused gaze, soon became a silent reference. In the classroom, she was the same as before, dedicated, attentive, passionate about calculations and structures. But there was a difference. Now, she studied not only for herself, but for all the women who still dreamed of occupying spaces that machismo insists on denying. She carried a purpose. The full scholarship paid her tuition, but what truly drove Rosa was something else. The desire to build a future where no woman would have to bow down to prejudice. There, among books and projects, she began to build the next level of her own story. She didn't need to bang on the table or raise her voice. Rosa silenced the engineer with something no one could dispute: knowledge. And there, before so many who doubted, she proved that feminine courage doesn't shout. It builds, brick by brick, word by word. What was supposed to be another day of invisibility turned into a life lesson. She not only faced prejudice in the workplace, but also transformed the space she worked in. With empathy, intelligence, and determination, she showed that dignity doesn't ask for permission. It arrives and stays. And the most beautiful thing, Rosa didn't want revenge. She wanted justice, a silent justice that inspires, transforms, and makes us rethink. Her moving story as a woman doesn't end with applause. It ends with respect and with new beginnings for so many others like her. Ultimately, she taught us more than engineering. She taught us that a woman's place is wherever she wants to build her story, whether in a classroom, on a construction site, or in the hearts of those who learn by example.